Hello, 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 hello. Welcome again, everyone. It's so good to have you back for another edition of Michigan Birding 101. We are super excited to share with you today our last in our series of 4 classes. And today we are talking about spring migration. Thank goodness winter is coming to an end. It has been a long winter for me. I don't know about you, but I am super excited to start hearing songbirds again calling and to start seeing the snow melt. And that's what we're diving into today. So if this is your first time joining us before, this program is brought to you by Michigan Sea Grant, a program of MSU Extension. We are federally funded through NIFA, and we are committed to diversity and civil rights. And we also have a land acknowledgement to recognize that we are on tribal lands and that we seek to promote and work with our tribal partners across the state. If this is your first time again, or if you just need a reminder, we have a chat box at the bottom of your screen. So if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see a little chat box, and I've already seen some cool comments coming in, some people sharing some great resources, and that's what that's for. Get chatty on there, share cool stuff that's going on. You can talk to each other. I might ask you questions. You can put them in the chat there. But we also will have a Q&A tonight with not just me, but also a special guest who will be coming on later in a little bit. And you can put questions for us for the end in the Q&A box. Make sure they go in there or we might miss them. Another reminder as well that tonight is being recorded as our other 3 classes were, and we do have plans to get those closed captioned, and they actually should be up on our Michigan Sea Grant YouTube, hopefully within the next few weeks. All right, so let's dive into it today. I've got another poll for you. If you were around last week, I had to learn a little bit about these, but I wanted to know, just as a quick poll, and this is launching now in front of your screens, and you can just click yes or no. Have you ever been to a birding festival or on a guided birding trip? And part of why I asked that is because it's springtime, and that's normally when a lot of these are offered. Now, of course, this year, there's not nearly as many in-person offerings as normal. But in a normal year, as we move forward, fingers crossed, there will be a lot of opportunities to get out and go birding with other people. And I'm seeing that a lot of people, about 75% or so, as the answers are coming in here, have not done this. And I would encourage you, once it's safe to do so, to definitely get out and bird with other people. We covered in our first 2 weeks a lot about how to be a birder, how to use your binoculars, how to use a field guide, and how to kind of identify what's in your own backyard. But I will say the best way to learn is really to get out there, whether you use a paid guide or a paid festival or find some free walks in your own neighborhoods. Go out with other birders, because that is one of the best ways to learn. And so I'm going to end the poll now, but I really thank you for answering. That's really enlightening. It's about a quarter of you have been birding with other folks before on a guide or on a festival, and about 3/4 have not. So lots of opportunity out there. I also have another question for you. I'm really excited to hear this. What is a species that you would like to see in Michigan that you have not seen before? What is one bird species you'd love to see? Can you put that in the chat for me? That would just make my day, because I love hearing about the different birds that people are excited to see, because it gets me excited to see those birds again, even if I've seen them hundreds of times before. So snowy owl, ooh, time's running out for that one for this year, although there are still some around. Spruce grouse, that's a tough one, but that is an awesome bird. Indigo buntings, just beautiful birds. Kirtland's warbler, a Michigan specialty. So wow, lots of birds coming in, and I'm noticing that a lot of these birds, you're going to start having an opportunity to see them in the next coming months, because spring migration is here and a lot of birds are going to start showing up. So you can keep telling me in the chat there what kind of birds you're excited to see, and maybe you'll get to see at least some pictures of some of those as we dive into spring migration. All right. Oh, and by the way, if you didn't know what bird this is on the picture here, here's a little quiz for you. And that maybe you might be able to figure out what it is. If you looked at that bird, it did have a black head and white wing bars, which helps get you down to just a few birds here, the Baltimore and Orchard Oriole, which are 2 that we have in Michigan. But as you saw in that other picture, it's that bright orange. So just again, a quick recap of how do we do our ID skills, looking at that bill like that. This is actually an Oriole, Baltimore Oriole, and they're actually related in the same family with blackbirds. Alrighty, so I still see some stuff coming through in the chat. Glad to have you keep sharing. And let's dive into our spring migration now. So today's goals: number one, have fun, get your questions answered, see cool bird pictures. That's our ultimate goal each week here with the Michigan Birding 101 class. But we also have two other goals. Two, learn how, when, and why birds migrate. Bird migration is a fascinating subject, and we're going to dive into how, when, and why birds migrate. And then third, I really hope that you can leave at the end here with some ways to plan your next spring birding trip. And I really should have added this as a fourth one, is also how can we protect the spring migrants that are coming through. So we'll share a few resources on how you can plan out your own spring birding trip. Okay, so how, when, and why do birds migrate? And these are three different species of swallows that migrate up pretty early in the springtime. And so the first question is, why do they migrate? Why go through the trouble of soaring all across? And you can see this is a migration map of Wilson's warbler on the right here. And one of the big the main reason they migrate is for resources. And one of the major resources is a driving factor for why birds move in the most part, and that is food. Food. Oh, that looks good. I haven't had dinner yet. So the Wilson's warbler is one of these species that migrates for food, and they head up north to go breed in the far north regions of North America. But as you notice, they're passing through a bunch of other areas, and part of that passing through is actually, in some cases, to get food resources along the way. So this is what they like to eat: little insects, flying insects primarily. And one of those in particular is the midge. Now, I can't pause this animation, but when you see these colors represent the density of Wilson's warbler sightings. So basically it's a map of where they are, and you can see the months ticking by and weeks down there on the bottom. So that tells you the different time of year. And you can see in the spring, they soar through all of North America rather fast for a little tiny bird that weighs less than an ounce. But when they pass through the Great Lakes, they time this migration so that they can access food resources while they go. So when they get to their breeding grounds, they're healthy and ready to start making young. And so when they get to the Great Lakes, one of the most things that boggles my mind, there's tons of warbler species that pass through the Great Lakes in the month of May mostly. And when they're passing through in that month of May, it just happens to be the exact same time of year where a tiny little aquatic insect called a midge hatches out of the water and lands on the closest surface it can see. So it lands right on the trees and shrubs, right on the shoreline. And wouldn't you know it, that these warblers are flying over the Great Lakes. They actually soar over big chunks of the Great Lakes. And when they get across the Great Lake, that's a big flight, and they're tired, and they land on the shoreline. And right there on the edge of the shoreline when they land is a bounty, a feast of these midges. If you've ever walked on a rocky shoreline in the Great Lakes in May, you will hit a tree and all of a sudden a cloud of midge will land up. Well, this is basically like an all-you-can-eat buffet just waiting there for these warblers that time their migration just in sync with these hatches. This phenology is just absolutely incredible, and that is why a lot of birds migrate, to get to different food resources. And some of those timings are just amazing. Okay, another reason birds migrate is to get to nesting habitats and to have space to stretch out to either avoid predators or to have the proper nesting structures. So this is barn swallows, actually a global species, but this is the South American, North American map here. And you're seeing that the barn swallows spread out all across a huge chunk of North America. And their main nesting structure is actually on a lot of barns, believe it or not, or other human-built structures. Cliffs will work for them sometimes, but what they really like to do is create a mud structure where they actually use their own saliva, and they migrate north where they have a plethora of this space to spread out so they're not too dense and crowding each other out. So nesting habitat is another reason that birds migrate, and to avoid predators that may, for example, if you are a ground nester, you may go up to the tundra where there's very few predators other than maybe just a few Arctic foxes, and you don't have to deal with all the weasels and all the squirrels that may be eating your eggs if you're a ground nester farther south. So those are some of the reasons that birds migrate. It's really all connected to getting to the resources that they need to make young and to further their population. Now, how do they do it? How do they know where to migrate? You saw that the Wilson's warbler was pretty far north, but some species have very specific locations they have to go to, tiny little islands way out in the ocean where maybe some seabird colonies might nest, or cliff sides way up in Greenland where maybe a gyrfalcon might nest. And these are really specific places. How the heck do they find it when they start out maybe all the way down in South America and Brazil, spending the winters in the nice balmy rainforest, the Amazon rainforest? How do they get all the way up and exactly to where they need to go? Well, there are three primary thoughts on this, but really it's a mystery. There's a lot of unknowns with migrations, especially when it comes to the mechanisms that trigger this for birds. But ornithologists have figured out quite a few things, and they're really mind-blowing. First off, visually. So these birds are born, for example, like a Connecticut warbler is born up in the boreal forest, and that tiny baby bird will grow to an adult in a matter of a month, sometimes even less than a month, 3 weeks. And those birds, it's thought, can actually imprint onto the stars and actually memorize stars as navigational maps. They may also use the sun and where it actually sets. They may also use the landscapes. Things like rivers or ridges are known to be places where birds often are concentrated and flowing through in migration in high numbers. And so visually, a lot of birds can use these features like star, sun, and landscape to help them navigate. But what's even more interesting is magnetically. They can actually sense the electromagnetic wavelengths of the Earth and detect basically like a compass using their inner ear. Their inner ear has amounts of iron in it, some species, and they are actually able to detect the magnetic field of the Earth to navigate just like a compass does. And then finally, there's some research, and that may not necessarily be for Kirtland's warbler, and all these aren't for these three specific species. I just wanted to put up some cool species. These are for all birds in general. Some have a variety of these things. But anyway, there's some studies that show that some birds even have a map of the world through their nose. And so they actually memorize the smells of particular places. Homing finches are one example that's been studied to show that they actually smell their way home, which is just truly incredible. So the senses of birds are just something that are way beyond what we have in some ways. And that is a bit about how they know how to get to where they're going. Okay, now how far do they go? Well, that really depends on the species, but here's just some cool examples. This is the Arctic tern. You may have heard of this example, but it still just blows my mind. 70,000 kilometers per year is how far they migrate. There was some backpack studies where they put little geolocators on these birds, just like they did with the snowy owls, and they measured some anywhere from 50 to 70, even somewhere up to almost 100,000 kilometers in 1 year. So 70,000 kilometers or 43,000 miles is a really long ways to go. And they basically go from the Antarctic all the way to the North Pole in a single year. And this bird weighs like a quarter of a pound, right? That's like a banana or like a banana and a half. And that tiny little banana weight bird can fly from the Antarctic to the North Pole. That is just insane. I can't even get to the North Pole if I tried with all of the modern technology I have. And so it's just absolutely amazing that just on their wings, these birds fly all that distance, and they do it every year. For some of these birds, they can live up to 25, actually 35 years is the oldest Arctic tern. And by the time that they get to that age, they've basically flown to the moon and starting to head back. That's how far they've gone in their lives. Just truly incredible. And what they're doing as they keep flying is basically just finding those food resources. They like little minnows, little fish, and they're just stopping everywhere there's a little bait pile, and they've got it timed perfectly to sync with that phenology. So just really, truly incredible. But not all birds migrate far. And in fact, not even all birds migrate north and south. Some birds, like the red crossbill, are really irregular movers. And these movers, as you can see here, don't necessarily go really far north, but some years they'll go north, some years they'll go south. But I want to pause it right there. And if you look in the middle between the eastern and the western population, there's actually a bit of orange in the middle. And that's because in some years, these birds actually move east and west. All the red crossbills do, they're basically the nomads of the bird world. They just go fly around until they find a bunch of cones, that they can get the seeds out of the cone crop. And in fact, these birds pair up and they mate for life, and they will go around until they find a big cone crop and nest wherever they find a big cone crop, regardless of the time of year. So these birds could nest in the dead of winter, they could nest in August. They just basically fly around until they find enough food to say, okay, time to make babies, and then they have their nest. So just a really a different end of the spectrum, not really a true migrant, but these birds do move to find the resources. So that is a little bit about how, when, and why, or how, where, and why birds migrate. And now let's hone in a little bit on Michigan spring in particular. So it's said that we're currently in our second or third phase of spring. I think this may be a fool's spring, or it's the spring of deception. If you've seen that little infographic that shows the 12 seasons of Michigan, we definitely have several phases of spring. But for most birds, March is the start of spring, and when many of them start moving around. So before we get into that, I want to do a little bit of review from our earlier classes and let you hear some of the sounds of spring that are coming our way. And we're going to do a little bird quiz right now. And I'm going to pop up a poll question, and I'm going to play a bird call for you and see if you can guess which bird species is making that call. And again, a lot of these birds calls that I'm going to play are some of the first migrants that you might actually be hearing now in the month of March. So let's launch this first poll here. So this poll is asking, which bird species is this call here? Oh yeah, thank you, Cindy. Don't answer in the chat, just answer with the poll. Okay, you hear that long trill. It's either A, a red-winged blackbird, B, a blue jay, C, rose-breasted grosbeak, or D, dark-eyed junco. All right, last chance to get your answers in. Last call. Last bird call. And a lot of you got that right. It is the red-winged blackbird, A. That wonderful sound is the male red-winged blackbird, who was one of the first spring passerine or songbird migrants to head back this way. And they are starting to show up across Michigan, even all the way up here in the UP. I saw some reports of one over on, actually in Canada, on St. Joseph Islands today. And so they are starting to come, and the males come first to stake out territory and get ready for the females to come, saying, look, I got a nice house for you, and this is where we're going to have our family. All right, let's go on to poll number 2. And this is going to be our second bird call quiz. So let's give it a little listen. Now, this is a call that you start to hear around March, and you'll hear it all through the summer, and you may even have heard it occasionally in the winter, because this bird actually isn't a very long-range migrant, although they do have small, shorter migration patterns. But this bird makes a different call that you're probably very familiar with, but this call is a little different. This is the black-capped chickadee. So the black-capped chickadee actually has a call that it makes more as a territorial or a mate attracting call, as opposed to the chickadee-dee-dee call, which we are more used to hearing. So yeah, black-capped chickadee. All right, good job, everyone. Lots of good results there. So, and if you not get it right, don't worry, we're just here to learn. Okay, this is our third quiz. So I gotta key up the music here. Here we go. All right, so I see lots of results coming in for this one that are very accurate. And again, this is another early spring migrant. They are coming in flocks now. starting to show up across most of the lower peninsula and will continue to increase number over the next few weeks. And that bird is the sandhill crane, the wonderful, majestic call of one of the largest and most impressive and beautiful birds we have, in my opinion, in Michigan. All right, last quiz here for everyone. This one is either a bald eagle, a Canada goose, or a crane, or a blue jay. I'll play it one more time for you. This is kind of a trick one. All right, a few more answers coming in now. All right, get your last answers in. I'm going to end the polling. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so a lot of people did get it right. That is the sound of a bald eagle. And you may be like, what? I thought a bald eagle makes a different sound, like that loud screeching sound. And that is because most TV shows play this call when they show you an eagle, and that is not an eagle call. That's a red-tailed hawk call. An eagle makes a silly giggle sound that a lot of people just can't believe is our national symbol. But yeah, that's what the eagle makes. All right. So we're going to skip past this last one here because I want to make sure we get to our fun interview here in just a minute. But that was a little taste for some of the March birds that you might start to hear over the next few days and weeks as we get into full spring here, March. You'll also notice that at this time of year, we have our winter birds head off. So right now the snowy owls are congregating in the UP. A friend of mine saw 13 snowy owls in 6 miles of driving yesterday. And that's because they're headed north and they're starting to kind of move up in small kind of loosely associated groups. Our finches are heading north, but in come some of our new or our early winter raptors, or early spring raptors rather. Rough-legged hawks and American kestrels are starting to show up in places in the north. Kestrels may have been down south all winter for some of you lower peninsula folks, but for us in the UP, we don't have them in the winter and they're starting to show back up. Bald eagles and golden eagles are also migrating now, those that spent the winter farther south and are heading north. We also have a lot of waterfalls. So if you're driving around ag fields in the lower peninsula right now, you may come across massive flocks of tundra swans in the Saginaw Bay region or in other agricultural regions. Canada geese, and maybe if you're lucky, a snowy goose or even a Ross's goose might be in there. And big flocks of dabblers start to show up as the ice melts. Some of these are around in the winter, especially in the lower peninsula, but we don't have a lot of these waterfall, and particularly in the UP since it ices up. And so these things are starting to head north, and those that were farther south are heading, so the numbers really increase. Of course, also the sandhill cranes and the blackbirds are coming in. Again, I'm just going to go through this really fast to give you a bit of flavor of spring migration, but I'll share some resources to where you can really dive deep into each species looking at the bar charts using eBird. So don't worry about memorizing this. It's just for fun. All right, so April, or pre-May, as I like to call it, is when you start to get a slow trickle of the early songbirds that you'll actually have quite a few more of in May. But the swallows, like tree swallows, rough-winged swallows, barn swallows come in. Meadowlarks, a beautiful and very loud bird, is out and about this time of year. Hermit thrushes are our early thrush that start to come in mid-April or so. And ruby-crowned kinglets are one of my favorite early spring songbirds. And of course, too, the sparrows come in this time of year. The fox sparrow is a big chunky sparrow, one of our largest North American sparrows. They are just a treat, and you can only really get them in early April, mid-April. By May, they're kind of moving through. So sparrows are another really good species group to focus in on in the month of April. We also get the first arrivals of some tern species, as well as large flocks of Bonaparte skulls. I've seen one of my favorite experiences birding in Kent County outside of Grand Rapids was a flock of about 500 Bonaparte skulls in a grassy field just as the snow was melting in early April. They're a really cool sight, and a gull species we only have in migration. They tend to move on farther north for the summer. All right. And then at the very end of April, and this is really actually not April, more into May, we start to get the floodgates open. One species group that people love, and sometimes some people are just, they don't care about any other bird. They just care about the hummingbirds. And there's a place for you if that's you, or if you just want to learn more about hummingbirds. Hummingbird Central tracks the migration of hummingbirds. This is the current map right now. They're down in the south, but they're starting to creep forward north a little bit in the eastern North America. So expect to see them at the last week of April or first week of May starting to come in. All right, then it's May. So we get this trickle of, we get raptors and we get waterfowl in March in good numbers. We get this trickle of songbirds starting to come in April, along with more raptors and more waterfowl. And then we have May, where you still have raptors coming through, like massive kettles of broadwings hawks. There's actually a count that takes place on the Detroit River where upwards of 100,000 broadwing hawks have been counted in a single day. It's amazing how fast and fierce these broadwing hawks move through, and sometimes in massive numbers. And then you, of course, get these backyard visitors that are super colorful starting to show up, like Baltimore Orioles, rose-breasted grosbeaks, scarlet tanagers, and indigo buntings. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, folks. May is insanity for warblers. We have 36 species of these tiny little color bombs that come up from Central America and South America. Things like the mourning warbler and the Kirtland's warbler and the chestnut-sided warbler. These are all pictures from my friend Sky Haas. Just amazing how many species of these tiny little half-ounce birds that are flying up from super far away. Just amazing. And some of them just keep going even farther north, and some will breed in the northern parts of Michigan or the southern parts, spend the summer here, but a lot keep heading north. And it's not done with that, people. There's vireos. There's half a dozen species of vireos. There's flycatchers, like the olive-sided flycatcher, one of my favorite birds, and another half dozen species of flycatchers. You got your wrens coming in, like the winter wren. You got the thrush. You got gray-cheek thrush and Swainson's thrush. You got shorebirds, over 20 different species of shorebirds starting to come through, and more waterfowl and more raptors. May is a month of insanity. It is the best time to be birding. It might be a little overwhelming sounding, but I guarantee you it is just so much fun. So definitely go bird in March, definitely go bird in April, but definitely get out and bird. If you're in the lower peninsula, the first 2 weeks of May. If you're in the upper peninsula, the last 2 weeks of May. Those are just the highlight times where you have the most species, the most diversity, the most of everything. All right, so hopefully that got you a little bit excited for spring migration, which is just now kicking off. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about, how do we know this stuff? You saw those amazing maps of migration. And if you check out eBird, there's all sorts of really cool bar charts. But that baseline data about how do we know that birds migrate? Well, a big part of that is because we have migration counters, like our guest today, Sky Haas. So Sky, feel free to turn on your camera. That's it. I was trying to multitask there. And I'm going to introduce Sky, and then we'll go through a little bit of questions. So Sky is an avid birder, tour guide, and biologist living in Marquette in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Sky grew up as a nature-loving birder kid. Me too. The lure of the wild was too great to ignore, and he moved to the north woods of the UP, to work at legendary Whitefish Point Bird Observatory, one of the best spring migration places in all the country, maybe all the world, and later attended Northern Michigan University, receiving a BS in conservation biology with an emphasis on evolution and ecology. As a field researcher, Sky specialized foremost as a migration counter, conducting raptor, songbird, and particular waterbird counts. His most recent field biology work has been on NOAA, doing seabird surveys and mammal surveys offshore with a focus on True's beaked whales. He's got the Cape May Observatory record of 1,026,000 migrating water birds counted in the season, that one of his seasons counting there. In addition to his years as a field biologist, Sky has ran his own guiding business, Borealis Birding, which we've showed the link to there, where he's a personal guide for folks who are looking for birds. And he also works with Eagle Eye Tours, Wild Side Tours, Nature Trek, Biggest Week, and Wings Tours, doing bird guides. Sky's passion and enthusiasm for being on a grand birding adventure is infectious, and in addition to helping to connect people in nature and getting opportunities to observe birds and other wildlife, he truly enjoys the ability to help educate tour participants on species, ecology, and evolutionary history. Thank you for joining us today, Sky, and I'm super excited to be able to chat with you. Sky is a person I absolutely love birding with. He is a wealth of knowledge. So Good to have you here, Sky.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me, Elliot.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here. And I do want to remind you, if you have questions for Sky as we talk, feel free to put them in the Q&A. He's going to stick around for the Q&A at the end of our session, but I'm going to ask him a few questions first. So Sky, you said that migration counting is sort of your specialty. Can you explain the job of a migration counter? What are some of the highs and lows of that type of position?
Sure. Well, a migration counter is one way to describe it is you're running an endurance test of yourself. You're basically what we're doing is we're out there collecting the data for migrating birds. It's usually a season's worth, anywhere from a month to 3 months of monitoring. We usually do it from just one location. We have a set spot. For water birds, we try to put accounts sticking out on a little point of land into the ocean or a Great Lake, a ridge top for watching hawks. You're definitely trying to use geography to create the best sort of sampling method for observing the passage of migration. Typically so for water birds, what time you start and what time of year you're running, it depends on the protocol. But typically for like at Whitefish Point Bird Observatory, the hawk count starts in early March, and then the waterbird count starts about a month later and runs through to the end of May. And for waterbirds, they move early in the morning, so we're out there at first light. We count depending on the count for either the morning or sometimes for an entire day. And then hawks, they tend to migrate later in the morning. They want to have the warm air thermals to pick up and migrate on. So I like counting hawks. You don't have to be up at the crack of dawn. So
yeah,
so you're just collecting all this data for to try to see what's going on. The weather is always a challenge because it's you can't just pack up and leave if it's a nasty day, because as they say, negative data is data still. So we want to know what day birds are flying and what conditions they don't like flying, which often involves a poor migration counter being all bundled up and just sort of questioning one's life decisions for a few hours before you can escape the wind and the cold. But the good parts are amazing too. Just getting to witness the spectacle that is migration. I don't know. It's something that's always been very exciting for me, and it came easy to me to just hone in on waterbird migration, and it's thrilling to be able to participate in this scientific method of collecting data of these birds, and what is just such a interesting facet of their biology. I mean, everybody knows birds sing. Everybody knows that birds, raise young out of eggs and nests. But what because we can see this, we can see a robin doing that in our backyard. But what a lot of people don't see is the massive passages that these birds are making in their life cycles.
Yeah,
and the migration counts shine a little bit of light on that.
It's really, truly impressive, the work that you migration counters do. I just wanted to share really quick. This is the waterbird shack at Whitefish Point. And so you can see it's a pretty, that's where, Sky, you've done quite a few counts. And like you were saying, you have to stand out there all morning long up till, how long are you guys out there till? You start at dawn? And
it's an 8-hour shift at Whitefish Point, and that's the short one. Out at Cape May or Point Pinos, we're doing dawn to dusk.
And you can see that that's pretty far away from the water. So Sky's, I think, underemphasizing how skilled they have to be, these migration counters, because they're identifying flocks of ducks sometimes miles away using spotting scopes. And it's really a highly technical skill set that you migration counters have to be able to do that kind of identification on the fly. Really impressive. Sky, can you share what are some of your favorite Whitefish Point memories? I just shared that, and I know that's where you've done a lot of your migration counts. What are your some fondest memories of Whitefish Point?
Yeah, well, I mean, Whitefish Point is certainly it's my favorite place. I grew up in Metro Detroit, so I've always been a Michigander, and my parents first took me up there when I was a little kid, and I was already just enamored with the wildness of the area. And so I first started working for Whitefish Point, 20 years ago now. I was a pretty green bird watcher, I feel, in those days still. And their information and knowledge, and that really allowed me to just get to immerse myself and learn so much. And so just the paradigm shift that happened in my first season of counting at Whitefish Point was certainly a life-changing one for me. And I like to say it's the moment I went from being a bird watcher to a birder. But yeah, so there's which favorite memory. I mean, every spring, every fall, it's always a special season there. I think one of my most favorite Whitefish Point memories actually is just from a couple of years ago. We had it was a cold start to the season, and it just went on and on and on, just weeks and weeks of just snow and north winds, and nothing was migrating, and it was really kind of got old after a while. But you just you get patient. Like I said, it's an endurance contest. Because we knew when that weather would finally break, and 3 weeks of virtually no migration. We just had, I think it was like 18,000 sandhill cranes, and in just a couple of days, we had an afternoon with over 100 kestrels and harriers going by. I mean, just like everywhere you looked, there were birds for like 4 days straight. It was a month's worth of migration in just a couple of days, and that still, I think, is my favorite moment. There was just is better than Christmas.
Yeah, that analogy of open the floodgates. They really do. They get bottled up, and then all of a sudden, migration is just unworldly there. Yeah, and some amazing rarities at Whitefish Point too. I know I've seen some really cool stuff with you there, like a shiny cowbird. What is that? A Central American or South American cowbird species that showed up just in the UP.
Right. No, Whitefish Point is absolutely legendary. It's these points sticking out into large bodies of water. They concentrate birds, and in particular, I think the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is it's kind of really getting a name for itself on the national scale for being just such an interesting vagrant trap. So you have birds that are migrating, and we know their species have a pretty set range that they tend to use and travel through, but birds also have wings, so they end up in some weird places, and we tend to call those vagrants. And Whitefish Point excels at both, with just huge volumes of migrating birds that are supposed to be there, as well as just it's a notable spot for all these rarities, these vagrants that have been traveling in the wrong direction. And because we're the Upper Peninsula is just such a coast heavy geological feature that a lot of birds there, they just end up traveling the entire length of the UP till they end up at Whitefish Point, which is in so many ways the end of the road.
Yeah.
For land. Although sometimes who knows what happens to these birds, but yeah, we've seen a lot of great things there. So
yeah, that's really cool. So you mentioned these kind of migration concentration points. So the idea that raptors, they don't really like to cross water, and so they'll kind of get funneled to these points, and then where they can finally get up the nerve to cross over the water, and then the waterfowl follow the shorelines, the songbirds follow the shoreline, and they get concentrated. Can you tell us about some of your other favorite kind of migration hotspots across Michigan specifically? Maybe some of the Lower Peninsula and Upper Peninsula ones that are similar to Whitefish Point that you like?
Sure. Well, my I often say water birds are my day job, but what I love to do is just wander around in the bushes and have warblers in my face. I mean, I love what you said earlier, the color bombs. I'm stealing that. Yeah, so my favorite way to do spring migration is definitely to wander some little patch of habitat along the coast looking for songbirds. One spot in particular I love is Peninsula Point near Escanaba. It's like this little miniature version of Point Peely, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard before. It just fills up with scarlet tanagers and warblers and vireos. A lot of those photos you were showing earlier of the warblers, a good majority of them were taken at Peninsula Point. But we're lucky here in Michigan. We're full of places like Peninsula Point. So I grew up in Metro Detroit, and my grandmother was a board member for Detroit Audubon. So I went on a lot of the spring campouts with Detroit Audubon growing up. And they would often go up to the Camp Mangotasi, which is just near Tawas Point. And Tawas is the place. Tawas is, it's great because it's close to Lansing, Ann Arbor, Detroit. So, the vast majority of, citizens in Michigan, they can just get out to Tawas Point for a day or a weekend. And the amount of birds that use that area is definitely worth the trip. Point Mouillet down in Metro Detroit's another spot that I used to go to a lot growing up, and it's great because it has another suite of birds that we have not talked about so much yet, and those are the shorebirds, the sandpipers, the plovers, these really awesome wild-looking birds called whimbrels. They're a type of curlew. These are all found in Point Mouillet in the spring, and sometimes, just in hundreds, if not thousands of them will be present down there at Mouillet. And then I guess another place I have to mention is Brockway Mountain up in Copper Harbor at the very northern end of Michigan. Is a fantastic spot to watch hawks. There's several hawk watching locations throughout Michigan, the Detroit River, Whitefish Point, but at Brockway up there in Copper Harbor, you get some great looks at hawks. The ridge is so high up that often we're looking down at golden eagles as they're passing by.
Wow.
And I'm seeing a question here. Someone wants to know about Western Michigan. For Western Michigan people, Berrien County, like the Warren Dunes area, the Sarrett Nature Center, and the Tiscornia waterfront park. These are all places that if I was going to go birds in spring migration, I would be going there.
Yeah, I normally like to do an annual pilgrimage to Berrien County the first week of May to get these kind of southern warblers that we don't get up here in the UP, like hooded warbler and the yellow-throated warbler. And Michigan's really cool because we do have such an extent of habitat. The southern part, you get these special warblers, and then up here in the northern part, we get things like Canada warbler, and if you're lucky, Connecticut warbler, and some of these others. So we really do have a lot of amazing places to go birding. So thanks for sharing some of those. So I know that you've also done migration counts at a lot of other places. Can you just in like a minute and a half or something, give us a couple highlights of just like a few, like another place and like a cool thing you saw there or a cool event that happened?
Sure. Well, I've counted. So I've counted the North Coast here on Lake Superior. I've counted the East Coast at Avalon, which was an amazing amount of birds. We had my very first season there. We had over 1 million water birds migrate by, which was pretty amazing. What I tend to call it. Whitefish Point was where I did my undergrad work. Cape May was where I got my master's degree, and then my final waterbird count project I did, which I just called getting my doctorate, was the Point Pinos waterbird count project out in Monterey, California, and that was an incredible. That was probably the best, coolest job I've ever been on, and it gets all summed up like this. There's the hundreds of thousands of shearwaters and loons and phalaropes that are migrating by, but in my first 3 hours on the job, I saw a pair of blue whales go by. So that just everything else was gravy.
Yeah, really incredible. So could you maybe summarize what you think is why is it important for migrations counts to take place, and what can we learn from them, or what have we learned from them?
Okay, great question. It's a lot of reasons. Migration counts, they give us this bottleneck location that we can observe a lot of birds moving by. And, a good example of why we just want to stay in one spot and count these birds is it's an effective way to monitor populations in some cases. That Monterey job I was just talking about, in a 6-week period, I ended up counting, it was like 29% of the world's Pacific loons in that 6-week period. So like if one was going to be trying to survey Pacific loons, I mean, they nest all across the Arctic tundra, so that'd be a really hard way to survey them. And then they're just, also overwintering out on the open ocean. Pretty much impossible to survey a population, but because like I said, almost 30% of the world's population migrate past Monterey, California. It's an effective way to be able to keep tabs on a species overall population numbers and look for trend lines. There's because just because you might have like a poor season, that's not necessarily says, we don't want to say, this bird is in trouble now, it's getting threatened. But in a long term, you look at a 20-year data set, and at like Whitefish Point, we've been collecting data at Whitefish Point for 40 years now, and we continually see common loon numbers are going down. Some species are going up, but like common loon is definitely a bird that is not so common anymore. Another really valuable reason for doing these migration counts is we get to see changes in their status and distribution and their occurrence levels, and also it becomes a good monitor for climate change. There's already several studies from using long-term migration count data that is showing that for spring birds, that their return date is happening on average earlier and earlier now, especially in the last 10 years. And, within fall migration, birds are definitely showing up much, much later. For example, like at Cape May, the water bird count there has been running for 30 years. And they used to have a peak of their scoters, which is one of the main birds that migrate past there, kind of our bread and butter bird there. They used to peak around Halloween. Now they're peaking almost about, getting close to Thanksgiving. So that's almost,
Wow.
3 weeks a month of a population shifting the majority of its migration. So without these migration counts, we would not have that, yardstick to measure these things by.
Wow, Sky, thank you so much for sharing. It's really cool to hear about your different experiences and really interesting to hear about the importance of monitoring bird populations so that we can have a pulse on the health of our ecosystems and climate. So we're going to come back to you in just a minute, but I'm going to share a couple resources and we'll get into our Q&A. So if you want to plan your spring birding trips, the nice thing about Michigan is you don't have to go far. So birding trails are a great resource we have across Michigan, and these have highlights of where you can see birds in these locations. And you can go to the Michigan Audubon website and check out birding trails, and that can be a great way to help plan your trips. Oops, one more, I forgot about that one. There's also a lot of festivals. I'm not going to spend too much on time with this because most of these are canceled this year, but basically April, May, and the first weekend of June, there are festivals across the state where you can go on guided trips at a pretty low rate, and they are a lot of fun and a great way to improve your skills and get out there and see some amazing things. And even Whitefish Point has a spring fling the last weekend in April, so put that on your calendar for 2022. And then another great resource is eBird. They actually have a tool called Birdcast that monitors live migrations for you. So if you want to know if today is going to be a good birding day, this tool does that for you, and it uses both habitat and Doppler radar because there's so many birds migrating in the spring. They actually show up at night on Doppler radar, and we can look at that radar overnight to know how dense that migration was. Last but not least is eBird, which has a ton of resources for planning trips, including just the simple look at your local hotspots. So this is Bay City here, and these pins are hotspots, and you can click on them and see what people are reporting. They also have bar charts for you can put in all of Michigan or a county, and these are months, each column here where these bars are, and it shows you that, for example, the Bufflehead peaks in April and May, early May, and then, or early April, March and April rather, and then tails off in May. So you can kind of target species by the time of year using these. Of course, you can also report your birds to eBird, which helps citizen science efforts fuel real science research on bird health and distribution. You can be a part of that migration count yourself by reporting birds to eBird. And last but not least, we all have a role in helping these birds. Literally billions of birds are flying over our head every single spring. Many of us don't know it, but those birds are in jeopardy. Lights from humans can really throw off their navigational abilities. So if you have lights on at night, turn them off if you can. Keep your cats indoors. We've already talked about how outdoor cats kill billions of birds every year in North America. Invest in window strike deterrence. So, using these simple methods, you can stop birds from smacking into your windows, and then upload your sightings to eBird. And then finally, try native landscaping and don't use pesticides. These are things we covered in our last classes, but I wanted to put them as a reminder that they're especially important in the spring migration months when we have these rivers of birds flying overhead. Okay, with that, we have now about 10 minutes for our Q&A time, and Sky, if you can come back on here, and Cindy's going to tell us some questions that we got. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and let's see what questions are out there.
Wow, thanks so much, Sky. I know I've been out to Whitefish Point, and I'm just amazed at watching the counters out there. And one of our questions that came in is, how do you count those large? I mean, like you're talking when the thousands are going by, how do you figure that out? You're not counting each one. I know that. So.
Yeah, it's we're using a mix of methods. Often birds aren't, even on the really, really big days, there's still a pacing to the rate of which they're flying by. So, sometimes it is literally just counting by ones. But, you definitely, the longer you're at it, the better you kind of get at estimating numbers. So, when I'm like out at one of the ocean counts, you can get really big numbers of birds going. So I'll often be using a tally clicker in my hands, and sometimes I'll even have to switch where I'm like clicking by ones to clicking by tens to clicking by 50s even. And when they're really rocking, sometimes you just got to be like, well, that's about what 500 scoters looks like, and you have to move on to the next flock. And when time allows for a little more nuance, I try to count one by one, but a lot of it is just scanning and clicking birds in with tally counters. I often have my telescope is hanging with several, like anywhere from like 5 to 20 tally clickers, and it like becomes like muscle memory where I'm just staring through the scope clicking as these birds are flying by. And it's a challenge. It's fun. I like it.
It does sound like a challenge. Now, we've talked about birds migrating at night. Are there birds that migrate during the day then, Elliot? And how do you know, or Sky, and which different birds do which?
Want to answer, Sky, or
Yeah, sure. Definitely there are, a lot of birds do sort out into like, are they diurnal migrants or are they nocturnal migrants? By and large, larger, that tends to be larger birds are day migrants. One of the big reasons why they think nocturnal migration happens is that it's safer for birds because they're not as exposed to predators. Like a peregrine falcon can pick off, a duck migrating. But with these sharp-shinned hawks that are trying to get warblers, the warblers just feel like, okay, the safest thing we can do is migrate at night. Hawks tend to be day migrants, and then waterbirds are goofy. They will fly both at night and during the day. So there's a mix of methods that birds will even use within species. And like I was saying, warblers are mostly a nighttime migrant. But here along the shores of the Great Lakes, we do get this interesting phenomenon called morning flight, where songbirds find themselves a few miles offshore over the lakes. And, they don't want to be there during the daytime, so they make a beeline for the closest point of land. And then from there, they will often have to do some sort of reorientation flight to get to where they want to be for the rest of the day. And that'll sometimes happen for a couple hours into the morning.
Thanks. So we talked about how, they kind of navigate sometimes, but somebody was wondering, how do birds see compared to human eyes, and how do they not run into trees in the forest?
Well, birds are really amazing. And, the ways that their eyes work and their brains process is probably hard for us to perceive. They see light in higher and in a wider range. They can see ultraviolet lights, and that actually makes some birds look different colors to other birds. And so, yeah, they have a different range on the electromagnetic spectrum they can see. So that's kind of neat. How they avoid the trees or each other, for example, in a murmuration, I'm not sure the answer to that. I think it's just ingrained into their biology, these quick muscle memory responses that they have and the ability. And you do have to remember, too, they're a lot smaller. So a gap that we see in a tree that's like, oh, I'm going to have to be squeezing through there, that's actually a pretty sizable gap for most birds since they're a lot smaller than us. But Guy, do you have any other insight on that?
No, just to agree with you. Physiologically speaking, birds are amazing. They definitely, we got the brains, but they got the skills.
That's a great summary right there. Thanks.
Switching over to one of my favorite birds, somebody's asking a question about migrating hummingbirds. Do they return to a specific spot? For example, this person's backyard or my backyard, the same bird. Is that coming back to the same spot?
I'm not totally sure on what's called, I think, is it called site fidelity of species to particular nesting locations? So there's a wide range across bird species. Some don't return to the same area and some return very specifically. I was talking about the gyrfalcon that, there's 2,000 years of gyrfalcon guana under this exact same spot on a cliffside. So they're returning to the same spot. Hummingbirds, I would assume, probably don't have a ton of site fidelity since they're kind of small, but I don't know if you have any other insight on that, Sky.
Yeah, I don't know about hummingbirds in particular, but it does seem that a good chunk of birds do have a site fidelity to their favored breeding location. I know that the loon researcher Joe Kaplan, who works at Seney National Wildlife Refuge, he really sort of determined that this that the loons had a really high site fidelity to their breeding ponds, and that this actually, the concept of like birds mating for life is not actually the best way to thinking about it, that it's like these birds have chosen this nesting spot for life. And so then you have the this male female pair that like we're beholden to this spot, so we keep coming back to this spot. But then the moment that one of those one of that male female pair doesn't show back up, the other bird that is on that site's like, okay, well, you're lost, I'll go find someone new, because it's about this spot, not necessarily its partner.
That's interesting. We certainly saw that play out in the eagle nest, where the male that I watch on the webcams, and the male didn't come back one year, and the female eventually raised the young and then moved on to another mate in the same nest. Somebody did ask, do eagles return to the same nest year after year? And my understanding is that's true.
Yeah.
Yep. Definitely. There's a nice big one here in Pickford. And I did do a little search, and I found at least one source that seemed it had an actual paper cited that hummingbirds do have pretty high site fidelity, so they do return, but they do die. So if you have had one for 20 years, it's probably not the same one for 20 years. Their lifespans aren't super long, although they can hang around for a while and get lucky. So
it's an interesting question here. Do you think that the pandemic has affected birds?
The pandemic has affected nearly every aspect of human life. And because we are one of the most dramatic impacts on local ecosystems, the answer probably is yes to some degree. And one of the larger impacts has been the reduction in travel, which I know has kind of lessened air pollution in certain places because there's less people out and about traveling. Probably not enough to slow climate change or anything, but it probably does replicate what we need to do, which is really cut back on our carbon emissions. So there's some of that. There, of course, are negative impacts too, like the pandemic has sort of seen a huge resurge in disposable plastics and disposable masks and things like that, and that ends up as microplastics, which are really becoming an increasingly large problem, especially for seabirds and other aquatic animals that are consuming these pieces of plastic. So yes, it's probably had some impacts, but it's hard certainly to know at this point what those might be. It's also had a big impact on birders and birding. There's anecdotal stuff coming out right now that's saying that birding has really increased as people look for ways to maintain their mental health and still find a way to get out and enjoy nature safely and engage with it. And that may have a big lasting impact, because generally birders learned about birds and loving birds, and then they learn the reality that many bird species are in a lot of trouble, and we're to blame for that. And so hopefully it will create more conservationists and people taking action to help protect those birds.
And that, my friend, is an excellent segue into thanking everybody for being part of our Birding 101 class, because that's exactly what we sure hope you will go forth and bird all this year and beyond. And it's 8:01, so I want to make sure to be real conscious of people's time and say thank you to Sky and to Elliot and to everybody who has attended over these times. Elliot, are you planning on sticking around to do a couple of questions?
Yeah, I can stick around for a few more
All
questions for
right.
like
But we
another
do
5
want to
minutes.
let people know that if they need to go, we understand it. We won't stay on too long, though, Elliot. We're not
Oh.
going to stay on too long.
I don't know if Sky and I get chatting, we might be
I-
a while.
We do have a question that said, did you see in the news that a couple in Illinois saw a yellow cardinal? Had you
Yeah.
seen that?
Yeah. So yellow cardinal made a big splash a few years ago, and these color variants. I think recently half male plumaged, half female plumaged cardinal also made the news, and these are really cool. Plumage variations are caused for a number of different genetic abnormalities that cause either albinism or melanism, where there's extra pigment. The
Hey,
yellow
Sky, we're
one
getting a
is
little
really
bit of feedback on your computer on that. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. So
Elliot.
yeah, but it is just that it's an anomaly, and it's pretty cool to see.
I saw an albino robin at MSU in the horticulture gardens. That was pretty exciting to see. Is a midge what fisher persons call fish flies?
No, there are actually a ton of different aquatic insects. In fact, most of our insects that we have, a lot of them spend a huge portion of their life, maybe years, in the water and then eventually come out and hatch. The Great Lakes are a massive bowl of basically insect breeding. And fish flies, I think, are maybe stone flies or there's the problem with that is there's a lot of common names that get thrown around for these things, but there are other hatches besides midges. We have the mayflies, you have stone flies that hatch out, and they happen throughout different times of the year, in summer primarily, and those again are taken advantage of by different birds. Like a variety of different colonial bird nesters might take advantage of the mayfly hatch, and these provide really protein rich sources for a lot of our birds that are dependent on the Great Lakes.
Here's an interesting question too. Why do some birds migrate so far north instead of just flying to the forested areas in the northern U.S. or southern Canada? Why do they keep going?
You want to answer that one, Sky?
Yeah, it's all about food resources. I'm sure you've heard stories about just how miserable the Arctic is in regards to its mosquito situation. But that's a lot of food for baby birds. There's a lot of studies have shown, for example, that warblers actually that they evolved in the tropics, and that they began to go farther and farther to search for food resources, and that ultimately becomes a trade-off of the dangers of migration, of traveling so far to the boom that is summer feeding for raising a nest full of babies. So it's there's a lot of insects in the far north, and that's why they're going that far up. And because there's also so many so in the tropics already a ton of birds that are year-round residents, so that's there's only so many resources, so they're trying to exploit these boom resources in the far north.
I see Amber's still on, and she asked, she's going to be in Gaylord in mid-May. So what about the good birding spots there?
That is not a place that I have birded in mid-May, but it is a spot where very close to where Kirtland's warblers come. So there are guided Kirtland's warblers tours, if you've never seen one, in Gaylord, where people come from around the country to see these birds, because this is the only place in the world that this bird nests. They have a very small population. In fact, it was almost under 200 singing males at one point. They were nearly extinct. They were brought back from the verge of extinction, but they're still a very small population. Just a few thousand of these birds. And so that's what most people go to the Gaylord Grayling area for. And the Forest Service, in partnership with the local Audubon, does some guided tours to take people to where they are. So that's probably what most people go for. But just find a local pond or river, follow the rivers and walk along the river areas. That can be really good during migration. Wastewater treatment plants are actually exceptionally great places to bird watch if you have one that you're able to access or see the ponds from. They can attract waterfowls, and along the edges, there'll be lots of midges hatching out of them. So good places for migrants too.
Do just have someone asking, Sky, do you teach any classes on bird or wildlife photography?
Not currently. I've done some outreach stuff with my Borealis birding company, but I have some plans to do some birding teaching classes next year, but nothing currently.
Great. One other question on there is, are there opportunities for the general public to be involved in or observe the migration counts at Whitefish Point or Brockway Mountain?
Yeah, it's visitors are always welcome. They're the counters there, they are hired by the organizations that are running these sites, and so there's not really any volunteer type opportunities. But honestly, one of the ways that I became a birder was just by going up to Whitefish Point and sitting there on the hawk deck, sitting there by the water bird shack, and just listening to what the other birders had to say, how they did it, and you just eventually you start soaking it up. I think one of the best ways that a bird watcher can contribute to science is, as Elliot had brought up earlier, to use eBird. eBird is a fantastic method to get people engaged and take their sightings and turn it into meaningful data. And even if one's still just starting out as a beginning birder, there are people who vet this data. So, crazy stuff gets caught. And the important thing is just like the individual data points, the more the merrier. So definitely eBird is a fantastic resource to contribute.
Yeah, and Wanda also mentions in our chat that they are looking for volunteers to help count Kirtland warblers. And someone else just posted citizen science projects through Cornell Lab of Ornithology too. So anytime we get involved in those, yeah. Yeah,
Cornell is who runs eBird, so that's probably most of their science projects run through eBird now. But yeah, they do have a few other offshoots.
So one question, what effect do you think the wind farms are having on migration of songbirds?
Yeah, so it's kind of a double-edged sword with wind farms. Climate change is one of the biggest threats to bird species in the world right now. It affects nearly every bird species across the world, and there's definitely more that are going to be harmed by it than they're going to be helped by it. And so wind farms are a potential energy source to really help offset that. But unfortunately, right now, there hasn't been a ton of consideration on wind farm management to help reduce bird kills. Birds do run into the turbines, and there's studies going on now to try to exactly evaluate that impact. That doesn't mean that wind farms can't happen in a way that is safe for birds. There are methods of marking the blades in a way such that they are less likely to be hit by a bird, to be more visible. There is also a lot of consideration that has to take place on where the wind farms go, because migration, although it is pretty massive and across the whole country, does have migration hotspots and funnels like we talked about. So placing a wind farm where those migration funnels are could potentially have a really negative impact, whereas opposed to placing them where migration is much more dispersed might have a much lower impact. So it is an issue that needs to be considered with wind farms. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Sky.
Yeah, just real quick. It's location is a big part of it. I think style of wind farm goes a long way too. I personally would like to see us move away as a society from the big, huge wind farms to a more dispersed level of windmills being just, installed throughout communities on to help sort of, keep the effects of a massive farm down. But like the location is a big one. Like we definitely here in the Great Lakes, it's the Fish and Wildlife currently recommends that they don't put towers within 10 miles of the lake shore. But currently, there is no actual regulation that forces the wind companies to do it. So we do have companies that are putting wind towers right up on the lake shore, because you get good gusts of wind. They are definitely favorable locations for wind. But the very famous birder and author Ken Kaufman, who I'm sure at least some of you have probably heard before, he had a great statement about wind farms being on coastlines, of why that you have all these birds pouring off the water during migration, and it's dawn, they're coming in, they're tired, they've been migrating for hundreds of miles, and they're making a landing on the shore. So as Ken Kaufman says, you wouldn't put a turbine at the end of an airplane runway. So why would we do it at the end runway for migration? And I like that. So it's about sighting. Sighting is a big part.
Interesting. Yeah, this is a great. So I'm gonna let this one be the last one, because it's getting about that time. We got to wrap up. There's some that we haven't been able to get to, and I apologize for that. But there's just so many great questions here. But I love this one because it's a very much a bird activity that we will all see as beginning birders and experienced birders. I often see a very large bird with a tiny bird flying close by. What's up with that? So I'm assuming, to me, that's a raptor getting chased by a smaller bird, or so it's always, for me, it's always the birds ganging up on the bigger bird, and so it's always surprising when you see, and it's all subjective as to which is, you don't know if could be an eagle with crows, it could be a hawk with jays chasing it. It's always fun to see that, I think, and it's always amazing that the bigger bird doesn't just turn around and take a swipe at him.
Yeah, that mobbing behavior is really interesting and unique. You may have even experienced it if you walk too close to a red-winged blackbird nest. They may start dive bombing you, and there'll be actually mixed species flocks of birds that will gang up. I've seen here on campus a long-eared owl at Lake Superior State University. That I heard this crazy sounding squirrel, and I looked up, and there were like a squirrel and a chipmunk and a chickadee and a crow and a blue jay, and they were all just ticked off like none other. And that was because there was a long-eared owl snuggled up against that tree there. Not for much longer. He kind of got pushed out by them. But yeah, so those birds do have that instinct to get those predators out of there, even if it means working with different species to get it done.
So I just want to say thanks again to everybody for tuning in, and I hope that you'll go forth and find some really fun bird activity, watch their behaviors, learn those backyard birds. And a lot of folks are putting in we hope you're going to do another one. We hope we're going to do another one too, but we're not sure yet what it's going to be. There's been some great suggestions about like doing a raptor class or doing a warbler class, and we get so excited. We'd be happy to do them all, but we do have to do other things in our jobs too. So thanks everybody. Sky, thanks so much. Elliot, awesome as always.
Bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.